while ago, I was obsessively refreshing the Rainbow Factory's Game Banana page to check up on the totally not disappointing results of the months of work I put into that mod, and I just so happened to stumble across one of the oldest submissions I ever made. That being Luminian Driftway, aka the Mariokart track I based off New Lumos from Miitopia. Now, I have a lot of nostalgia for this course. It was one of the first mods I had ever made, it was the first time I downloaded and used Blender in my life, and it taught me a lot about the basics of modding and game design, and it was overall a very fun time. Unfortunately, rose-colored glasses can't really change the fact that this track is absolute garbage. I mean, why the hell does the background look like cardboard cutouts slapped onto fucking plasterboard? What the fuck was I even doing? Anyways, after revisiting my old work, I suddenly reflected on the over 1.5 years of modeling experience I gained modding Tomodachi Life and Miitopia, and it made me ask myself if, perhaps, I could now go back and be able to fix my track into not looking like complete horseshit. The answer to that question? A resounding yes. It took me less than 2 hours. It wasn't even difficult in the slightest. Turns out, not only knowing how to modify material data, but also knowing what material data even is in the first place is a bit of a game changer. I uploaded this new version to the page and was suddenly surprised about how many people actually cared about this course. Doing even more reflecting, I remembered a promise that a younger, much less experienced version of myself made to what was then an even smaller audience than I have now, and decided that maybe I could do them justice and revisit an old idea a year and a half later. Today, I'm going to be going through the process of how I turned my favorite Miitopia area of all time into a playable and hopefully halfway decent track for Mariokart 8 Deluxe. So I guess we should start with the first step. Obviously, if I wanted to make a Mariokart track, I'd have to create the actual model of the course first. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking that it was a pretty easy process to rip the model for Sterile Plant and port it directly into Mariokart 8 Deluxe, but unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as a process as it may seem. See, computers don't have an infinite amount of processing power, so game developers such as Nintendo typically remove a lot of unnecessary details from their games. One of their tricks is to replace background elements with pictures, and so nearly all of Miitopia's stages are full of JPEGs slapped onto simple meshes. Sterile Plant is not an exception to this rule. In fact, the only actual three-dimensional geometry in the entire model are the lava lamps in the foreground, the grass, floors, and the actual enclosure itself. Every other element is just a PNG. You will never unsee this. Now, this works in a game with very fixed camera angles, but in a race that has the player actively moving through and interacting with the area, the illusion quickly falls apart. I had to go back and replace every one of those images with their actual geometric counterparts, and you better believe it was a monotonous and time-consuming task. After I was finished, it was time to decide on the actual layout of the course, and instead of making whatever random road I came up with and slapping it into the background, I decided to constrict the track to only using the elements of the area itself. Eventually, I decided on a short and compact track that made the most of the given space without being repetitive. Starting in the middle, the player drives across a bridge connecting the first and second circles and is met with an immediate quarter-circle turn that leads into a glider ramp. Flying over the center, they drive across and drift through another quarter-circle turn leading into a second glider ramp that sends them to the third and final outer circle. Doing an entire half-circle turn, they jump off a final glider ramp that leads them right back to the beginning. With the layout set in mind, it was time to restructure the model accordingly. I added the bridges, created some extra landing ground for the gliders, and sprinkled signs across the track to help give direction to some of the sharper turns. I then ported it into Track Studio, as now it was time to get the track to actually look like it came from Miitopia. Here, I set the material data of the meshes and edited the lighting to be more in line with the area of the original game. I remade the material animations, and after everything was looking good, I created the collision model so the carts would actually have something to drive on. Finally, it was time to move on to step number 2. Now that I've built the course and got it looking how I wanted, it was time to create the path for the drivers to race on. In Mariokart 8 Deluxe, this is done with the BML file, which creates a bunch of points along the track to create various paths for different purposes. To start off everything, I made what are called lap paths. These tell the game where the drivers are supposed to be going, while also creating the boundaries that tell Lakitu when to bring players back to the track. After I set them all up, I added 6 lap checks to count the lap and then modified some of the respawn points to avoid respawn loops. Now I had to get the enemy drivers to move through the course, so I added an enemy path for them to follow. I then copied the enemy path data for the item paths, which direct targeting items such as blue shells and red shells, and then did the same thing for the paths responsible for steer assists. After creating the path for my glider ramps, I added the camera points to create the cutscene that plays before the beginning of each course, and to top it all off, I added several rows of item boxes and sprinkled some coins along the track for players to collect. My course was fully playable at this point, but there are a few final things I needed to wrap up before I was content with my project. In order to finish up my mod and get it ready to publish, there were a couple small things I needed to get done before it was ready. First, I'd obviously want the music of my track to actually fit the theme of Sterile Plant, so I needed to replace the old course theme with the battle theme of Nimbus. I did this by ripping the music from my dumped copy of Miitopia, adjusting the audio volume in Audacity, and then importing it into Citric Composer. I set up the loop points, exported the new data file, and then did the same thing with the sped up version of the theme for the final app. I then replaced the old Toad Harbor theme with my new files. Another thing I needed to replace was the mini-map that shows where drivers are along the track, so I needed to head back into Track Studio to create a new one. First, I took a screenshot of just the road using the minimap editor, and then saved the camera position so that the character icons would match up with the actual minimap texture. I then edited my minimap texture to desaturate the color and remove unnecessary details, then I compressed it to 480 by 480 pixels. Finally, I used Switch Toolbox to replace the old texture, and then everything was finished. I had finally completed my course. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with how the results turned out. I know I presented this process as very streamlined for the sake of keeping the video watchable, but this was several days of going back and forth between all the steps of the process, testing it out in game, and then redoing my old work to get it working better. It took quite a bit of effort to get this thing working like how I wanted, but it was really fun to return to Mariokart modding after so long. I may even consider creating an entire Miitopia Grand Prix depending on how well this video does. Before I show you the video of the final course, I'd like to mention that I don't have a capture card for my Switch, nor a PC that's powerful enough to handle emulating Mariokart 8 Deluxe, which means I had to use the Switch's capture card feature for this. So there will be several jumps during the playthrough of the course. With all that said, the download link is in the description, and I hope you enjoy my Mariokart track.